Hello, and welcome to the Exponential Growth Podcast, powered by Analyst Investors. I'm your host, David Olivencia, co-founder of Analyst Investors, and a passionate advocate for leveraging innovation and technology to drive success. In this podcast, we'll dive into the strategies that top leaders, investors, and entrepreneurs are using to navigate and thrive in this era of accelerating technological change. Whether you're looking to lead more effectively, make smarter investments, or understand how to harness disruptive technologies for exponential growth, this podcast is for you. Each episode will feature conversations with visionary thinkers, industry pioneers, and innovative leaders who are redefining what's possible in today's rapidly evolving world. So if you're ready to start and stay ahead of this curve, let's get started. This is Exponential Growth. All right, everyone. Well, hey, welcome to another edition of the Exponential Growth Podcast. Today, we have an amazing guest, somebody I've known almost 2 decades. You know, it's funny. We both, well, we've lived all over the place. I met him, I think he was living in Boston. I was living in Michigan. And then, I don't know, the last 10 years or so, we spent some time living together in the Chicagoland area. Now he's in between Chicago and Florida, but an amazing career, you know, definitely in financial services industry, was the CEO of Santander Payments, was the president of Diners Club. I remember working at Anderson Consulting and racking up a bunch of Diners Club points, but he was the president of Diners Club and that amazing credit card. Get some startup experience with Riverwood, so maybe you'll touch a little bit on that. And right now is the group head for the Latino Segment for BMO. And with me and several other amazing leaders is also a co-founder of Analyst Investors. So, you know, investing, startup, banking, credit cards, kind of a global experience that you'll hear a little bit more about. It's an honor to have on the Exponential Growth Podcast today, Eduardo Tobon. Eduardo, welcome.
Thank you, David. A pleasure always to see you and be part of this podcast series that you have, which is an amazing way for anyone to learn and talk about exponential growth. Very excited about it.
Excellent. Well, so you have an amazing story. We always start out like, just tell us a little bit about your story. Let our listeners understand your story. You have an amazing one. I mean, I've been kind of a part of the last 20 years of it or so. But give our readers, and it's been amazing. So give our listeners out there a little bit about your story, about Eduardo.
Yeah, happy to do so. It's never life is never a straight line from the bottom left all the way up to the right. We all, you know, gain experiences in our careers and our lives, and that's been the case for me. I've lived in multiple countries. I visited more countries that I lived in, and that has created a lens for me to look at life and at opportunities and businesses. It's served me very, very well. So I grew up in Colombia, in Latin America. Came for my master's degree at Carnegie Mellon, which today is the Tepper School of Business, and the rest has been history. The reality is the opportunities in this land of opportunity that we have to experience in the U.S. It's just real. And in my case, I got a chance to work in strategy consulting early on. That led me into financial services, which has been the vast majority of my career. And I ended up working for one of my clients. And that got me into the banking business, eventually leading into a multitude and sequential higher opportunities within a bank. And that bank became Santander, which was one of the largest, still today, one of the largest banks around the world, largest European bank for sure. And they invested in the U.S. and I had an opportunity as a result of that investment and the purchase of 100% of the bank I was with to then go into running the payments business in North America from scratch. And so I had to hire, you know, almost 100 people and look at that time frame very fondly because it's starting a company within a company, right? It's intrapreneurship, as I would call it. You get the funding from a corporation, but you have to have the spirit of an entrepreneur and figure out ways in which you're going to grow, right? And the payments
you're
business,
accountable for it too, and you're accountable for that growth too, right?
100%, fully accountable. You never do it alone. There's always a lot of people that help because it's never one person, but you have to put a strategy together, you have to put a plan together, an execution of it. And I was very blessed, in that journey. I had a lot of great mentors, a lot of, mentees that I brought along the way. I'll mention a few because it's probably important sometimes to, give credit to the people that brought us to where we are, and then the people that we had an opportunity to bring along. So Nuno Matos, who today is the CEO of ANZ, which is Australia's and New Zealand's largest bank in many ways. He actually was a Santander at that time. He had run a payments business in Brazil. He came to run the majority of the bank in US. And he said, hey, I believe that you could, end up bringing a lot of great sort of growth into this business in North America. And so I learned a lot from him, but I also was able to bring folks along the way, folks that today are CEOs, and I'm quite proud of that. So Pablo Jimenez today is the CEO of GetNet. Craig Bondell is the CEO of Tesco Insurance and in UK. There's been a lot of other folks that are now been CEOs and now are back into other roles. Banu Pulela, for example, was CEO of Spend Labs. So there's a lot of folks that I had a chance and opportunity to hire and bring along. I'm going to miss a few of them naturally, but the reality is, Annabelle Skalberg, she's in private equity right now. She was, in finance with me. Chris Hoopa, today is running all risk and fraud for T-Mobile. He was running risk for me and for the bank at that time for the payments business. So a lot of great folks that came along and added a lot of value and brought other people underneath them. And the rest has been history. From there, I catapulted into an opportunity that I couldn't say no to. And it was to run Diners Club International globally, the payments network. That forced me in a good way to move to Chicago. My family followed me as part of that move. We had lived 13 years at that point in Boston and moved to Chicago. It was a great move. Initially, my wife was not necessarily thrilled, but from a personal perspective, you look back and she's been thrilled that we did, make that move for ourselves, for our family, for our kids, for everything else. And it was a very global role. It was,
and it wasn't like, it wasn't that different too. When my wife and I, we recently got married, moved to Michigan. She didn't like it, and we kind of didn't like it, and then we fell in love with Michigan. Our 3 kids were born there, and even to this day, I think Michigan is probably one of the greatest states in the Midwest. City, I love Chicago, but yeah, you never, life gets you on this journey, and you never know what to, and then you get into places and you fall in love with them. So glad you saw that in Chicago.
In the Midwest, what a great place to raise a family, right? And so it sounds like you feel the same way. It was terrific for us as a family. And then from a business perspective, a business that required quite a bit of change because it had not changed in several decades. It had not had an infusion of capital. Discover Financial Services, who had bought the network business from Citibank, was willing to invest. I was willing to come in and try to make a very significant turnaround. And I can say that I was quite proud that took place. We were able to inject growth in a lot of different places around the world, but specifically and importantly in Asia, because there was a lot of growth in Asia in terms of population, trends, geographic trends, business trends. So partnering with the largest banks in some of those large economies like China, India, Japan, allowed us to turn around the business in a very, very significant way. And then, of course, the rest of the world, there was always, a crisis happening somewhere that you needed to pay some attention, and regulators, getting involved in the business in so many different ways. So learn a lot through that.
Well, and then how much, this people probably don't appreciate this. How often did you travel to Asia, and how much time were you on the road? And just give our listeners an extent. I mean, I know it. I find I travel a ton. But I found what do you during, knowing you during, it was amazing. So just give our listeners just a snapshot of that.
Yeah, a lot of people think it's very glamorous, and there's aspects of it that's glamorous. But at the end of the day, you're running a business. You got to be where their clients are. You have teams across, several different parts of the world. And like I mentioned, Asia was an area of growth for us. So I had to spend time in Asia with the teams in Asia and with our prospects and clients in Asia. So I was going to Asia probably a dozen times a year. Long trips. I didn't hit just one country. I typically would go 2, 3, sometimes 4 countries on a trip. Because I was traveling so much globally, not just Asia, at one point, 4 years into it, my wife actually started kind of telling me that I didn't realize, and this is you telling yourself stories that perhaps you end up believing. I thought it maybe was spending half a month abroad, and in reality was out of 30 regular days in a month, including weekends, I was 22 days out of the house. So
Wow.
you have jet lag situations you have to deal with. You leave on sometimes on a Sunday because you got to get there on a Monday, and then you come back and you're totally, your body probably needs some rest, and so you're really not even present in the weekend. So it was not an easy situation, but you go through the motions when you need to, right?
Yeah, you're 22 days outside of your home, but even when you're back home, you need a day or two to recover. So actually, like functioning days at home a month is like three.
Yeah. It's never been like that. That was the only time in my career for 4 years in a row that I had to do it. I did it. I'm proud I did it, but I'm also very glad that I don't have to do that level of travel anymore. So nothing compares to that.
Yeah, well, so then take us to BMO, and what you got going there. I mean, you had a little startup startup, not a little startup, an interesting startup in between, but maybe, touch on that briefly and then just walk us through what you got, all the great stuff you got going on at BMO.
Yeah, I mean, the BMO story is a great story. BMO is Bank of Montreal. For those folks that perhaps cannot necessarily pinpoint, the bank. The bank uses the brand as BMO, not BMO. And one of the folks that you and I know, Adela Cepeda, has been on the U.S. board for over 14 years. And so she was the one that actually initially sort of connected with me and said, hey, listen, I think there's an opportunity the bank has not been able to figure out. And even though you never really worked on a niche segment, I think this is one that potentially we can use your help with. I've been in general market situations for banking and payments and other things, and that it kind of struck a chord, right? I'm a Latino myself, very proud of being a Latino, and the segment itself has been growing so much, right? We have literally hundreds of thousands of companies that happen to be owned and led by Latinos and Latinas across our economy in US. And then many of them, when you start really looking at them, have grown to significant sizes. And so tapping into that growth engine, it's not necessarily as easy as you would think. You say, oh, well, maybe we have a regular market share based on banking of what we do and the presence that we have in the various verticals as any bank would. But we wanted to be much more thoughtful about that. And so when I started talking to the bank about that opportunity, I had a startup, as you mentioned, been working on that startup. We can talk about separately on that and the ups and downs of starting a company and growing a company from scratch with your own sort of investment in that situation. But this was going into a situation where it struck a chord with me personally. And I said, okay, I think we can do something special in terms of growth, something special in terms of market share gains. And so I decided to take that opportunity and obviously ended up putting a pause. There's been a permanent pause on that startup that I had. And the opportunity has been very simple to describe. We have a $4 trillion economy that Latinos in US generate. And the majority of that comes from not just the B2C side, consumers, but from the B2B side, companies that are generating employment and revenues and value across the entire, value chain. And when you think about those companies, none of them are necessarily going to raise their hand and say, well, I'm a Latino owned. Latinos, we are a difficult ethnicity to pinpoint. Every ethnicity has its own nuances and idiosyncrasies. In our case, we can have multiple different races. We can be bilingual. We can be English speaking only. We can be Spanish speaking only in some cases. The majority of the case, we're either English speaking or bilingual. But the companies, when you start looking at the numbers, they're very large. But nobody had a ranking. You have the Fortune 500 ranking that ranks from 1 to 500, the largest companies in America. And some of them happen to be Latino, but not necessarily a way for us to know if they are Latino owned, Latino led, etc. And so I was tasked with growing this segment, and I said, well, the first thing we need to do is rank them, and let's go and rank them from 1 to 500. And we've done that, and it's created a lot of visibility positively for everybody involved because it creates a sentiment around proud elements for everyone involved, saying, okay, I have a $50 million company, I have a $100 million company, I have a $500 million company, a $1 billion company, et cetera, et cetera. And nobody has ever recognized necessarily that that's important, right? It might not be part of the Fortune 500 in some cases, but if you get to be part of the Index 500 that's Latino owned, that's quite significant. And then if you fast forward a few years from now, maybe even decades from now, a lot of those, it always happens. The smaller companies today eventually become bigger, and the bigger companies today become mega companies, right? And they become, the largest companies you ever would dream. And so I expect that some of these companies that today are in our list, they will be many, many more part of the Fortune 500 more than ever. So it's been a great way for us to get to know those owners, to know those CEOs, CFOs, and for them to get to know us and gain market share. We've grown our CAGR, our compounded annual growth rate in the business has been north of 160% since I put together this strategy.
Wow, that's exponential growth. That is exponential growth. And it reminded me too about your earlier. I always talk about exponential growth, and we'll talk about some trends you see and all that kind of stuff. But the way you were talking, you're also an exponential grower, right? You were rattling off several different leaders that you help grow, and in addition to your companies and stuff like that. But it's also an important component about leadership. We'll talk a little bit more about that, but how you grow and create and spin off the next set of leaders, right? So what an amazing story. And I know you're just warming up
Oh,
on
thank
all
you.
the things you have and all the things you have next. Okay. So trends, right? So exponential growth, talk about trends. You have we've heard the life story. What's your lens? What would you like to tell our listeners out there? What trends should they be aware of from your lens, right? Realizing that, hey, everybody talks about AI, so I'm sure it is a bit, but maybe there's a unique lens, or maybe it's something totally different, right? But feel free to share the trends that you think that our listeners from your lens should be aware of.
Yeah, I mean, compounded annual growth rates is a very good way for people to look at industries and verticals and investments in venture capital, which you're part of and you lead. You get to see that because if you have a trend, if you ride that trend, it's never necessarily going to be a bad thing until the trend ends, of course, and we go through cycles. But the reality is that the compounded annual growth rate that's expected on several different sectors of our economy is going to continue to generate double-digit growth. The economy appears to continue to be very strong against a lot of challenges that you would normally see in this cycle. It's been a sort of long cycle for the U.S. economy and for the global economy. But as it relates to the specific sectors, I'll sort of talk general first, and then we'll go specific into some of the ones that I personally get the most involved with. But yes, you mentioned artificial intelligence and machine learning. That's growing, north of 35% in compounded annual growth rate, is expected to continue to be the case in kind of the 20%, and higher ranges. You have some aspects of renewable energy that are still growing at that level. You have some of the manufacturing aspects of vehicles, with autonomous vehicles specifically growing in very high double digits, kind of 20+%. From a defense and commercial perspective, shipbuilding has also been on the growth side. For this year, 2026 is expected to grow more than 17%. SEO and internet marketing still very strong, in double digits, north of 15%. 3D printing and rapid prototyping is also growing in double digits. You have a lot of, software and technology related enterprises that will be growing in very, very strong double digits. When I looked at the efforts that I do as it relates to the Latino-owned, Latino-led companies, we see a little bit of a different lens. We see growth in technology, and there's still probably, 10% of the list is in technology, and we'll probably continue to see many more startups getting scale. And as they gain scale, we see them getting into the list. But we have seen, historically speaking, very, very large components of those large companies that have grown over many decades to be in food and agribusiness, to be in engineering and construction, and it's expected. We see when you travel around, you see a lot of these trends, right? Mexican food, as an example, has achieved levels that were thought not possible before. People in the country may not realize we eat as much Mexican food as we eat Italian food. The difference between the two types of foods, which are both delicious, I hope you agree with me on that front, is that
Totally.
in the
No,
case of
no,
Mexican,
but look, my grandmothers were cooks in a Puerto Rican restaurant. I love Puerto Rican food. Mexican food is my go-to, man. I love Mexican food. Italian food too, but I think I put Mexican food at another level.
I love food in general. So, as
That's
long as
right.
it's shared, then I'm in. And I love sharing a meal with, a small restaurant or in the house, whatever the case may be. And you and I have done that a lot over the years. But the Mexican food situation is very restaurant centric. So 2/3 of the Mexican food, for example, is being served in restaurants, and 1/3 is being consumed at home. When you go to supermarkets and ultimately you end up buying the ingredients to make it at home. In the case of Italian, is the opposite. 2/3 is consumed at home. We all know that pasta and pizza, it's kind of relatively easy to cook at home, and you buy plenty of that. And then 1/3 is consumed in restaurants, and still plenty of Italian restaurants everywhere you go. So there's not lack of them. But the fact that both are similar sizes in the U.S. market is actually quite remarkable.
So those are some of the trends. Now you've got a background in businesses, growth, financial services, investing, right? This is where we want to give our and you've been a startup, you invest in startups, but you're also part of a bank that I don't say has a more conservative view on investments, but it has also different asset lines and what for our listeners out there, based on call it your worldview, your lens, there's all these exponential growth things that you rattled off. How should they be thinking about investing, positioning themselves for investing from your lens?
Yeah, I mean, giving investment advice is one of the hardest things, right? So the first thing you ought to say is I cannot sort of speak for others. I can only speak for myself, right? Because everybody has a different risk tolerance. They might have different nuances around their own situations. In my particular case, there are elements where I have to, regulatory wise, be very cognizant of things that I can and cannot invest, right? And so when it comes to private investments, there are certain things I'm allowed to do and certain things that I'm not allowed to do. Historically speaking, I have had a portfolio of different assets that more and more it's more difficult to find uncorrelated assets because the assets is starting to become globally more correlated with one another. The economies are starting to be more correlated with one another than in previous decades. But one of the things that I have found is if, for example, I'm going to invest in venture capital and in angel investing, which I've done, and I've learned that that's an area that can generate very significant returns with very high risk, right? And so you have to kind of put enough seeds for some of those seeds to ultimately give you outcomes, right? Not every single one of those seeds, and you've done it so many years, David, that you know exactly. What most investors don't realize is, you can have a 10x or 100x. Not very many people, very few people, in fact, will get 100x because it's hard to be that patient and get that lucky in some ways. But you may get the thesis right, the timing right, everything right, and you can get that level of return. But there's going to be a lot of ones that are going to be 1x's or 0x's, right? And so, but they can get very much blended into a very, very good positive return when you have enough of those seeds that are being planted. But I don't put a lot of my portfolio personally into high risk, high return, just because the age bracket that I'm in my current situation, I definitely have to have some components of my retirement that need to be more steady, as I would call them, steady Eddie. And so I've been using real estate, historically speaking, to provide income streams and a more solid, stable return, if you will. But I'm aware that in cases like that, I may be sacrificing potentially higher returns by virtue of just playing it more safe, right? So I'm balancing all those elements. There's an element in my case with my wife too. We as a couple look at investments. I've gotten my kids involved into investments. You've seen them probably at some of the Angeles investors meetings, and they get excited about precisely those discussions, but trying to make them understand precisely the components of risk return and to see, okay, if you put all the eggs in one basket, that may not necessarily work out. And so how do you spread things out, and how do you look at the investments from that lens?
Yeah, no, I like the framework that you say, hey, it's a bit of everybody should realize it's a personal, situation. Everybody's risk and reward tolerance is a little bit different, and everybody's at different stages in their life, as well. But you should be deliberate about it, really understand what stage you're on. You're like, what is ask yourself these deep questions. And then, you've laid out a bit of some diversification, regardless of all these exponential trends that are out there, right? You say, hey, I get it. I might be sacrificing some risk return for a little bit more stable, but I'm at a point in my life where, I don't need the 50x return. I want something steady. I don't know if I could stomach the 0x returns to wait for the 100x, right? That's out there. But no, and it's a good way to look at it. And, and I think for those who are listening to the podcast, if you listen to all the different leaders and you kind of stitch together all of their kind of perspectives and lenses on investing, I think it gives you a good way that you should treat investing, right? So I would ask the listeners continue to do that. Last one, Eduardo, leadership, right? So I loved that and actually probably one of the very, they always tell the stories, but very few have told the stories of how they've grown leaders, right? But we're in an interesting time. AI is going crazy, like and it's not slowing down. All kinds of tech, AI, call it virtual reality. You mentioned 3D printing, robots, the genome, all kinds of different directions. Leader, what would you tell our listeners? How should they think about leadership and leading teams, leading family, leading, just leadership in this age that we're in of exponential growth and rapid change? Do things change? Should they think about things differently? What are your thoughts?
It's a great question. First of all, having 3 adult children, you get a chance as a parent to experience firsthand, how do I generate enough grit in my kids that they want more success as opposed to coasting, right? That's one of the things that I always wrestle with. And I see that in the younger generations, where some leaders may say, I don't see necessarily the same level of grit. I'm one that does not look at it with that lens. I actually think that just every generation tends to be a little bit different. And every generational change has situations in which the older generation says the newer generation is not doing things the way that they thought they would, right? And so we get into that situation, and that's part of leadership, which is bringing in the new generation and the older generation, if you're in the middle of it, to coexist, to work together, to collaborate, and to speak with one another, and to do it in effective ways. So you got to be able to find ways on how to communicate to folks that are working with you, partnering with you from different angles, from different lenses, and get them to work with one another. So from an exponential growth perspective, what I tend to do when I lead is tends to be very, very simple. The first thing is I always looked at having a strategy together for anything that you're doing, right? So it's not, being opportunistic, which is always nice, but it's more about, okay, if we get lucky, that's great. But in my opinion, luck can be very much created in the sense that if you have preparation and opportunity comes, preparation meets opportunity, that can generate some level of luck. There is an element of luck that's completely outside of that, and that's okay. But if you can be in charge of certain aspects of your own future in the company, in as a leader, that's gonna allow you to lead with a vision that says, let's all create a strategy. Sometimes it's more than a few folks, and then have that execution that comes along to ultimately outperform others, right? Sometimes the best strategy in the world, if it's poorly executed, cannot really surpass a lesser strategy or a poor strategy that is very well executed, right? And so execution comes into play in a very big way. And the passion that people put into, and the time that people put into, really growing. And so when we talk about exponential growth, I've always been a believer of, you got to compare. And the first thing you compare to is yourself, right? And saying, okay, if I'm in the business of Y or X, what is, as a golfer, you sometimes think, okay, this is my handicap. Am I doing better than my handicap or worse than my handicap? So if you're a new person in a new business and you're a new leader, well, what's your benchmark, right? You're going to compare against yourself first and say, am I putting more hours into this? Am I being more productive? Not just the more hours, but the productivity that comes with those hours. Am I being smarter about things? Am I getting more output ultimately, right? Now you have a larger team. You're saying, okay, well, how do we compare, that with the tools that we're getting to accelerate, in some cases, 2 times, 3 times, 4 times what others have not been in the past able to do. And so that leadership permeates everything that you do. And then you start comparing in some cases against others, competitors, right? Which is natural to say, okay, well, we are here. Where's my competition? Sometimes the competition is way larger. Sometimes it's smaller, and what are they doing that I should be learning from them, right? And so that ability to compare in a positive way to say, okay, I got to be able to beat myself first, but also beat others in order to grow faster. And that's part of that, right? The mentality of you get different skills that come into play in every single company and every single group that you're leading, and how do you combine those skills to come, with the results that you would be expecting, and that the shareholders and investors would be expecting.
Yeah, it's I love the framework, and I was just writing down some notes that you talked, and I was kind of thought on a couple different dimensions, right? So regardless of what technology, exponential changes, AI, robotics, virtual reality, all that, you need a strategy. That's what you laid out, and you can have a great strategy, but if you have but in addition to you got to execute. And as a leader, you got to make sure you're executing. You got to have a great strategy, right? And then you gotta overperform is what the word you use, and execute on that. And then the other thing you mentioned, you got to have you get everybody, your team, well, definitely the leader, but then you got to, make sure that everybody's passionate. So regardless of all the technology, this stuff is not going to change, right? To win, in this environment. And then you talked about comparing to yourself, right? So, and you talk about exponential growth. This was like, if you just get one, like, I think it's something like, if everybody just improves 1% a day, 1%, just get a little bit better every day, like you 37 exit by the end of the year kind of thing, right? So if everybody's just, so you, and then, and as you were talking about that, but you think about, and then you talk about, hey, then you compare to others. But my gut is, I'm sure there is some comparison, but like a lot of the winners, you look at Apple, right? You look at Amazon. For the most part, they're setting the stage. Do they compare themselves against others? Yeah, maybe. But for the most part, they're going in a direction, and they're competing and comparing against themselves, and moving the ball forward. So I think it was a great, kind of call it leadership model, leadership framework. Nothing like out of the ordinary new, but really just highlighting key components, of leadership for our listeners that they can take with them as they, execute in these exponential times.
No,
Any
glad that
other
you like
last
that.
comments, Eduardo, before we drop?
No, thanks, David. I mean, I think, listen, sometimes it's the ordinary things done consistently that generate extraordinary results, right? And so the consistency aspects of it, the ability to do it across the board, do it daily, to your point, right? That is what can differentiate, a leader and the results and the performance in anything that you're doing, right? High performing athletes talk about that all the time. And so it goes not just into business, in every aspect of things. The reality is, with automation and with, intelligence, whether it's generative AI at some point, and super intelligence, if we ever were to reach that level, machines are going to be able to work 24/7, 365. They'll be able to collaborate with us while we're asleep, and they'll be very, very productive. And the reality is that's going to be impossible for any human being to match. We can't, operate without sleep. We can't operate, with certain conditions. But if we are able to augment things with precisely those type of tools, we can lead in a much more meaningful way.
Well, Eduardo, I know you've got A lot of things going on. I want to thank you for making it a priority to jump on the Exponential Growth Podcast. How do our members stay in contact with you on social media, and where would they go if they wanted to get that BMO list of all those great 100 companies that are out there?
Thank you, David. They'll probably best way for them to reach me is going to be on LinkedIn. I have a profile there at linkedin.com, and it's ETOBON, which is my initial and my last name. And they can look me up. I'm happy to look at folks that want to get in touch with me and get to learn more about the work that we do and how BMO can help. They go to our commercial banking website at BMO, BMO.com US. They can also find me and can reach me. But more importantly, as you and I know, I'm a very big believer in in-person interactions, not just social interactions. I get to attend many of the Angeles Investors events, both virtual and in person. And so I'd love to be able to see some of the folks that you are getting to see frequently at those events and at some of the other events that we do. So on the Index 500, we're doing several events this year. It's going to be one in Chicago coming up. We're going to have a press release about the list. So very soon we'll have that. And then we'll have major cities like Los Angeles, Dallas. We're going to have New York. We're going to have a very major event in Miami. We're going to do Las Vegas this year at a major conference. So, and there's going to be smaller venues with other cities. So there'll be plenty of opportunities for me to interact with many folks. Looking forward to it.
Excellent, Eduardo. Well, thanks for jumping on the Exponential Growth Podcast. Continued success. Look forward to seeing you the next time. Thank you.
Thank you for expanding this knowledge with everyone that you're getting a chance to interview. Thanks a lot, David.
Thanks.